The first old earth view to come about was called the gap theory. Let's read the first 2 verses of Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Then verse 2 reads, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." So what the gap theory does is it takes these 2 verses, splits them apart, and puts a gap of time in between them. So according to this view, God created the entire universe all in verse 1. Then there's a time period of billions of years where Lucifer, or the devil, reigned over the earth perfectly. You have dinosaurs on the earth and a race of people called pre-Adamites. Then Lucifer rebels against God, so God had to judge the earth with a flood called Lucifer's flood. And that's where all the rock layers and fossils come from. Then you have verse 2, but instead of it saying the earth was without form and void, they change it to say the earth became without form and void as a result of the judgment. Then God has to recreate the world, and that's what the 6 days are all about. Now let's unpack this. The first person to teach the gap theory was Thomas Chalmers, the founder of the Free Church of Scotland. He was first recorded teaching the gap theory in a lecture from 1814. Next, a man named G.H. Pember wrote a book titled Earth's Earliest Ages, which was used by many different pastors. Then Arthur Custance wrote another book on the gap theory titled Without Form and Void. These 3 men were really the ones who got the gap theory started, to the point where even the Prince of Preachers, Charles Spurgeon, took it seriously. Some of the effects of the gap theory are visible in commentaries. For example, the Scofield Reference Bible reads as follows: "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth made waste and empty by judgment," Jeremiah 4, "and the earth was without form and void." And then there's that's not in the Bible. That little comment there, that's not in the Bible. They added that. And in the Newberry Reference Bible, you have verse 1, and then it doesn't say anything. There's a literal gap of blank space before verse 2. Here's another commentary from Dake's Annotated Reference Bible. The anti-chaotic age from the original creation in verse 1 to chaos in verse 2, during which time Lucifer ruled the earth in perfection before he fell and caused the earth to be made chaotic and flooded. This age took in all the period of the dateless past, the original creations, Lucifer's reign in perfection, the period of rebellion by Lucifer and pre-Adamites, the actual war between heaven and earth, culminating in the defeat of Lucifer and his armies as they invaded heaven, and the chaotic period on earth after the defeat of Lucifer's kingdom. These periods were of unknown length and could be called the eternal past. Now, the obvious problem here is that none of this comes from the Bible. For example, there couldn't have been pre-Adamites, because 1 Corinthians tells us that Adam was the first man. So does the original Hebrew language that Genesis was written in allow for a gap between verse 1 and 2? Now don't get scared and run off. I won't get too technical. It's easy to understand. Now in Hebrew, there's a letter called a vav. Okay? This letter is used to indicate sequence in a narrative. For example, when vav is attached to the verb amar, which means say, it makes the word ve'amer, or and he said. This is called a vav consecutive. But Genesis 1 verse 2 doesn't have a vav consecutive. It actually starts with something else, called a vav disjunctive. Whenever a vav is attached to a noun, like the earth in verse 2, it indicates an aside or parenthetical statement. So in verse 1, you have the summary overview of creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then verse 2 is basically a parenthetical statement. Oh, by the way, let me tell you what the earth was like when God first made it. It was without form and void, darkness over the face of the deep, and so on. It's a description of the earth in verse 1. It's not even part of the narrative. It's an aside for additional information. The vav consecutive shows up in verse 3, and God said, "Let there be light." So you can't fit a gap between verse 1 and 2 because verse 2 is background information for verse 1. We see a similar kind of thing in the book of Jonah. You have the action. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. And then it goes, now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, 3 days' journey in breadth. And then it picks up the narrative again. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's journey, and on it goes. It stops to say, oh, by the way, here's what Nineveh was like. It's a description, not a part of the events of the narrative. A similar thing is happening with Genesis 2. Another attempt to justify the gap theory is to claim that the phrase, the earth was without form and void, should actually be translated, the earth became without form and void, which would imply some sort of judgment. Now let's see if this argument stands. Many gap theorists will accurately point out that the Hebrew word for was and for became are actually the exact same word, H-A-Y-A-H. So if this word can mean both was and became, is there any way of figuring out what it means in Genesis 1:2? Well, yes, there is. You see, many words have several meanings depending on context. There we go. So whenever we look at the word haya, which is how I believe it is pronounced, whenever you have a vav attached to a noun, so and the earth, plus this word haya, it always means was. It doesn't mean became. That is how the grammar is set up. You have the vav and the noun was. It's talking about a parenthetical description of the earth, and so it's not going to say became. It can't say became because it's not part of the narrative. Another argument for the gap theory uses Jeremiah 4:23, which reads, "I looked on the earth, and behold, it was without form and void, and to the heavens, and they had no light." Now, there's the same phrase that we find in Genesis 1:2, without form and void. Gap theorists will take that and say that because the phrase is used here in Jeremiah in the context of judgment, the Israelites for their sin, then it must mean that Genesis 1:2 is talking about the judgment of Lucifer's flood. The problem is that this phrase in Jeremiah is a literary allusion. Jeremiah is using vivid imagery to describe the desolation of the country of Judah after it was destroyed by the Babylonians. He's describing the emptiness of the land. Here is a comment on the subject by Professor of Old Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, R.B. Chisholm, Jr. It is unwarranted to assume that Jeremiah's use of the phrase in a context of judgment implies some sort of judgment in the context of Genesis 1:2. Jeremiah is not interpreting the meaning of Genesis 1:2. Then this is why it is so important to take every Bible verse in its context, because context determines meaning. One last argument made for the gap theory has to do with the King James Bible. In this version, when God created Adam and Eve, it reads, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it." So while other versions read that God said to fill the earth, in the King James Version, God told them to replenish the earth, which would imply that they are refilling the earth or filling it again after some kind of judgment. However, if we look at the original Hebrew word that God said, it means fill or fill up. God's not telling them to refill the earth, he's telling them to fill it up with descendants. So if this is what the Hebrew means, why does the King James Bible say replenish? Well, the word replenish in the King James Version was used in the 17th century when the version was translated to simply mean fill. It expressed such ideas as to stock, fill, supply, or inhabit. Replenish is related to the word replete. Being replete with happiness is being full with happiness. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the first recorded use of the word replenish to mean refill or to fill again occurred in 1612, 1 year after the King James Version was published. So in other words, the word has changed meaning since the time it was used in the King James Version. It's just an older English translation, so we need to understand a little about Old English. Aside from biblical problems, the gap theory suffers from logical issues as well. Now, the gap theory was invented to accommodate the supposed millions of years of geologic history, and as a result, fit the millions of years in a gap between verses 1 and 2, and reject Noah's flood. But the gap theory also states that the gap of time ended with a global flood called Lucifer's flood, which they claim is responsible for depositing the rock layers. But if Lucifer's flood formed the layers, then that destroys the whole reason for the gap of time in the first place. And at this point, you're just choosing which flood laid down the layers, a flood that is never mentioned in the Bible or a flood that is mentioned in the Bible. But the gap theorists would rather explain the Earth's geology with a made-up flood than the biblical one. They're admitting that a global flood can produce rock layers. So why don't they just believe in six-day creation and Noah's flood? The gap theory is fundamentally irrational. So is that it? Have we dismantled the gap theory? Well, not exactly. You see, just because the gap doesn't fit between verses 1 and 2, that doesn't mean people won't try to fit it other places. One variation of the gap theory that is more popular today is the literal day with gaps theory, which tries to fit millions of years in between each of the days of creation. God created the earth and light, and the evening and the morning were the first day, and then millions of years pass by, and then God creates the expanse on day 2. But we need to remember that God connects our work week with his creative process. We work for 6 consecutive days and then rest on the 7th, just like God told us he did. But if there were gaps of time in between each of the days, that would mean that God rested after each day. God created the expanse on day 2, and God rested. Created the land, sea, and plants on day 3, and God rested. But we aren't told God rested until day 7. So he couldn't have taken rest periods in between the days. Otherwise, that takes away the whole meaning of the Sabbath day. Let's be honest. It would be really nice if God did create this way. Then we'd only have to work for one day. Then we can take an indefinitely long weekend, then work one day and take another indefinitely long weekend. It would be nice, but that's not how God created. Some will claim that maybe God didn't rest in between the days. Maybe he was still working throughout the millions of years. This is called progressive creation, which teaches God started creating on a certain day, but that he kept creating in stages over millions of years before he started working on something else on a different day. The issue with this idea is that we are specifically told that whatever God commanded to be created was finished by the end of that day. God commanded, and it was so the second day, and it was so the third day, and it was so the fourth day. In every instance, God's creative act is completed by the end of the day, meaning there couldn't have been millions of years of creation between the days.